Welcome to another episode of Life on Mars. I'm Àlex, the CEO and founder of MarsBased. This episode is very special because we'll be talking to Brian Leonard, CEO and founder of Grouparoo. But Brian was mostly well known for being the CTO and co-founder of TaskRabbit, one of the hottest startups in the US in between 2009 and 2014 or so, until they got acquired by IKEA, the Swedish company, to expand to Europe and the rest of the world, right? And this episode in particular, we'll be talking about choosing the technology for your startup, especially if you got a CTO as a co-founder. It's relatively easy, or it seems so, but it's not, right? They went with a really good experiment in Ruby on Rails when they decided to adopt this technology when it was only 4 years old into the market. And how did they not choose Ruby on Rails for this new adventure in 2020? Not so much because Ruby on Rails is not valid anymore, but because it was a different kind of product. And you need to choose your technology depending on what kind of product you want to build, not whether it's trendy or not, or you're going to be finding developers easily or not, right? We also talked about transitioning from a purely B2C product like TaskRabbit was to a B2B product focused on an open source community like Grouparoo is. We also focused on his role as CTO, very oriented to product. And now as a CEO, how did he transition from being CTO, which is, a relatively private and inwards looking role into the company, to being the public face of a new company, right? And how to build a project around open source. I think those are the main takeaways from this episode, and I hope you will enjoy it. Welcome to Life on Mars, the podcast about innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship of MarsBased. We've got tonight a very special guest, the mighty Brian Leonard, CEO at Grouparoo. We met a couple of years ago when he was still working at TaskRabbit as a CTO, and if you remember correctly, one of the founding members of TaskRabbit as well. You were in Madrid trying to expand the international group of TaskRabbit that had been recently acquired by IKEA, and you're trying to build sort of the European branch of it. How are you doing, Brian? Welcome to the show.
Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
What happened between these two last years? Because you switched companies. Now you're the CEO and founder of Grouparoo. You want to tell us about that?
Yes. Not much has happened in the last 2 years. In the biggest news, there's a global pandemic, and I founded a new company. Those are by two the biggest things in my life at the moment. I was in Madrid working after the IKEA acquisition to get TaskRabbit launched in Europe and help IKEA hire some people in Spain. Both of those are happening. We're now in several countries in Europe. Definitely Spain, launched now in Madrid, Barcelona, and others, as well as Portugal, Germany, France. We've been in the UK for a while. I think next up on their list is Italy, but I'm not directly involved anymore.
Okay, yeah, that was I was going to ask, because you had been involved for 10 years, if I remember correctly, one of the technical co-founder. That means that you had been evolving the company technologically. You were, effectively speaking, so you were the CTO, as a matter of fact. And so one of the things that really struck me as surprising when we met in Madrid, you told me, was built on Ruby on Rails, right? And
sure.
That was one of the companies it's not that I didn't expect, but every day we find a new company that's built in Ruby on Rails, right? Can you tell us a little bit like that? Because we're a specialized company in Ruby on Rails, right? And we want to know, why did that decision happen? Like, why did you just choose it as a technology back then?
Yeah, that choice was made in 2008. So it was a long time ago.
Wow. Yeah.
It was on version 2 at the time, as I recall. And what I'd been doing before that was working at IBM, primarily in C++ and Java. And, like anybody that's used Ruby certainly knows, they optimized for developer happiness, right? And Rails on top of that was a breath of fresh air compared to the other options available at the time. Probably PHP, maybe PHP Cake, as I recall, was a sort of ish Rails thing that I might have tried. Yeah. But Rails was great at that time, and I dove fully into we made that choice on a hope I dove fully into the culture, like Rails casts and whole set of podcasts. I can't remember all the names now. Among many I remember listening to on the train was the people that started GitHub and like saying like, there's this new thing called Git and we're experimenting with it, right? Like this is very, very early in the journey at this point now.
Actually, and now that I was checking, so Rails was launched in 2004. That means it was only 4 years in when you decided to use it as a technology for TaskRabbit, right? And in one of our previous episodes, we were discussing with the CTO of Factorial, which is also a Ruby on Rails company from here, and they also bet for Teambox by around that time. So basically, when you're launching a company and you want to use the technology. And especially in a startup, you want to have a fine balance between using something too consolidated that, there's already a market there. Maybe, you will not be able to attract top tier technology people, developers and so forth, because they are working for companies with much more budget. But also you want to experiment with something new that you want to be able to have, long-term maintainability. And they explained that in the first company was Rails, went well. Second company was Elixir. Didn't go well, right? So how did you calculate risk here? Was it a calculated risk or was it just like, fuck it, we're going to use Ruby on Rails no matter what?
I think something I've heard that I think I believe in, overall I believe in using fairly boring technology. I don't think it's really about your business. If you are like magical AI business, then like maybe we need to process data as quickly as possible. Like maybe there's certain things to do. But if the innovation in your business is more product based, in general, my recommendation is to choose tried and true things. Like I never got on the Mongo bandwagon in the 2014 range. Like, MySQL or Postgres is completely fine with me. I think those are very good things. Rails, just 2008 was a less option time, right? Like there wasn't anything that great. Like I had been working in Drupal and maybe some Cake and some things like that in the PHP land, but web technology, like I think we experimented with it and it seemed to be good. And like it was if you're going to do that, only do one big bet on the technology, like everything else perfectly, and we're changing this one thing. I wouldn't switch to Elixir and use Kafka syncing to Mongo. Like I wouldn't do that. There's too many things that I don't know anything about. And so it was the one thing that, we didn't know about, and it seemed to be a huge leap forward.
And we're not even getting into the JavaScript frameworks for front end, right? Because I don't know, like 2009, I don't know what was around, but it was probably jQuery.
No, it's jQuery all the way, baby.
It was not even Ember back then, so
no, definitely
not around. But one of the cool things right now is that, fast forward to 2020, 2021, maybe, if you will. So big corporations right now have got Ruby on Rails, right? Because Microsoft acquired GitHub, acquired LinkedIn, acquired Wunderlist, 3 companies built with Ruby on Rails. IKEA acquired TaskRabbit, therefore they have Ruby on Rails. Ford acquired one of our clients, Spin, which is built in Ruby on Rails. So like big corporations right now have got a lot of Ruby on Rails going on, right? So it's
Sure.
Do you think it's sort of become maybe not mainstream, but like this solid technology we always wanted to be?
It's definitely mainstream. Like I think we want to keep you want to keep that indie vibe. The reality, real talk here for a second. Like the reality is that Amazon has some major Amazon projects were built on Ruby on Rails too. Like it's everywhere. And frankly, it's just a well-known solution. It's in the well-known bucket now, right? And it's not the hot new thing. Various people went to Elixir. Various people went to Node.
Closure.
And it's not you look at the Google Trends, like it's not the hot thing. And frankly, we had trouble hiring at TaskRabbit because we've literally talked to every single Rails developer in San Francisco. Like, it's not a joke. Like, there's only so many on LinkedIn. Some number comes up. Let's call it 3,000. We have talked to all of those people.
Wow.
And new people weren't bootstrapped. coding school kind of things are teaching Rails because it's super usable.
Correct.
But there was a huge gap in the middle, and even at the top, some people went to Scala and all these other things. And so we actually had trouble, and we adopted a remote strategy about 2 years ago, maybe even 3, so that we could get the best Ruby on Rails engineers that we could find anywhere in the country.
But also because, it's just not a matter of necessity. It's that everywhere in the Ruby on Rails world, like most companies, or at least the most proficient companies, perhaps they're offering this remote possibility, right? So now it's not, it's not an advantage to offer remote. It's actually the status quo. And if you're not doing remote, then you're behind, right? Certainly now. So when was it the year that TaskRabbit adopted it? Just to put it in the timeline.
I think we started hiring. We probably hired our first. Well, the first thing that happens in my experience is people that you hired, if you're on this journey, people that you hired locally decide they want to move to Austin or Salt Lake City or, whatever. And you're like, well, I like you and you're great. So, fine. And now, it's starting to happen. And you have to start changing your culture when that happens, for sure. More documentation, like making sure that you ask them for comments on the Zoom because they're less likely to jump in on a brainstorming session, things like that. And then in probably 2017 or so, we said, you know what, it was actually after we got acquired. So when TaskRabbit got acquired, we only had 12 engineers.
Oh, wow. It's pretty small for the.
It's pretty small. There's a lot of leverage in that story for sure. Back end, 4 apps, because we had a Tasker app and a client app, times 2 platforms, and a website, and all kinds of other stuff. Only 12 people. So a lot of leverage in our tooling there, and a lot of senior engineers, because I don't know, it's just not many people, and we were doing a lot of stuff. Then when we got acquired, we wanted to grow the team significantly, and in order to do that, we in 2017 went anywhere, senior engineers anywhere. Basically.
2 quick questions before we go into Grouparoo, which is your current adventure. First one is what changed in the culture, because you transitioned from non-remote to remote, right? Mm-hmm. I assume it was not remote first; it was just remote friendly. Correct me otherwise. But there's always a lot of struggle in these kind of transitions, right? Mostly because the company is not engineered for that, but also you've got a team that perhaps you wouldn't have hired if the company had been remote from the first in the first place, right? So, what company culture changes did you face here? Any kind of struggle you faced?
Yeah, I think where we started, and maybe even where they're still at, is hiring only senior engineers remotely. There's something about the mentoring and the pairing that we did with more junior engineers that didn't work as well, or we projected didn't work as well. Sort of the more questions they had to ask, the more autonomous they could be, the more likely they would be a successful remote employee. And that's where we started. And when you do that, a variety of changes, like I talked about, much more asynchronous written communication, which is a decent side effects of decisions made and documentation and things like that. But it's definitely harder work than chatting over coffee. And meeting things like I talked about, as a meeting leader, I often make sure that I check with people on the phone, leave space in the room, because you can't tell as easily when you can butt into the conversation with your idea. It's like a slight delay, or it's this voice from way over there. And so it's important to say is anyone on the call, or even specifically if someone you think might have something to say, or you're as a meeting leader, you were kind of watching the screen and they kind of went hey, Phil, do you have something to say here?
That kind of like a classroom, right? Kind of
Yeah,
like the
totally.
classroom. You know your students are not listening when you call them out by their name. They're like, oh yeah,
No,
totally.
I'm not
They
trying
were-
to catch them. I'm trying to get their input for sure. And be
Correct.
inviting to the input. So it's different to say, does anyone on the call have, something to say? Or I explain something. Does everyone on the call understand? No one's going to say no to that.
Correct.
But you can say, you can switch it around. You can say,
Good point.
Àlex, is there anything I could have explained better?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, more positive,
and then they'll
right?
be like, yeah, I got it because I'm not dumb. They don't want us to be dumb, right? I got it, but like I think you could have been clearer about this. And then I'll be like, oh yeah, would it helped if I said this thing? And then they'll, in general, you increase the culture of being ready to do that as well as understanding in that meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm joking here, but the stereotype of developer is a person who doesn't like talking, right? Doesn't like to talk. So therefore, the switch to remote, if you're not ready for that, like if you're not good at communicating, and chances are, if as a developer, you're a bit so on the communication side of things, then if it's forced onto you, so wow, like the same that, there was a lot of culture change for you guys and as a company, maybe somebody in the company felt like, oh, I don't want to be this company anymore because now it's remote and I got to do like more calls, or like more input, more communication. I was happy to just sit in a corner in the office and just like coding 8 to 10 hours a day, right? Something like that. The experience,
Maybe. I saw those people chatting a lot with lots of snacks. I think it was more the snacks than the introvert extrovert thing that they're missing at this point than the stereotypical with their headphones on. I think it's the ease of interruption and getting help.
Yep.
It feels like a whole thing. Something that used to be like, hey Brian, like this is weird. Like, can you explain this? Or like, why did you do this? Feels like a whole thing when you have to like reach out and like maybe even schedule a call. Like it's a serious thing. And like that's what's can be lost if you don't make that a norm.
Yeah, there's a lot of changes here, and for instance, as we tend to work more async, but some clients are extremely synchronous, and therefore there's a bit of a cultural clash here and there sometimes. And some of the clients, they're like, if you don't get any answer from me, book me on my calendar. I was like, dude, that's the most aggressive thing I could ever think of. Like, I don't want people to put like meetings in my calendar. How do you even accept that? But if you build your company around interruptions, then I don't think you're very, you're not striving for productivity, but whatever floats their boat, right? Just to give context to our audience, what kind of a CTO are you? Because we've spoken to political CTOs, fundraising CTOs, more like hacker CTOs. How would you define yourself as a CTO?
It's a good question. It's a little existential to think about it. I think I'm I'm a product CTO. I very much enjoy. I think there's a lot of leverage in a CTO that can work with the product team and or set the product direction themselves, which I was doing for quite a while at TaskRabbit. That understands how things are built and what's easy and what's hard, and like can sort of grease the wheels of progress there. I'm also like a builder CTO. It's actually quite challenging for me to like, at some point I stopped looking at all the pull requests, right? and building things myself.
Were you coding actually towards the end, or?
Oh yeah. For better or worse, the whole time. It changes what you're coding. Like in the beginning, obviously I was the only one and it was like everything. And then it's like critical features. And then basically by the end, even with 12, but certainly with 30 plus, like it's like non-critical, either exploratory or like, if this worked, it'd be great, but like it's not holding the business up. We talked a little bit before about like making a technological leap to, for me, at least to Ruby on Rails, like as a company, each of those leaps are super important. So the biggest leap that we made after that. And the only time I was as excited as I was from C to Ruby on Rails was when it was from Objective-C and Android to React Native. And so we were one of the first companies on React Native. And that it's not like we're jumping every time there's anything new. Like that was the only one, but it was a big bet. And so like prototyping our React Native app in 2015, which is very early.
Oh, wow. This is very
early. pre Android release. Like literally, we released a Tasker app to the Taskers on iOS before Facebook even released before Facebook even released the Android support.
Wow.
Basically,
it was you and Airbnb, basically, right? Or
yeah, very early for sure. And that was because it was just so much more productive. And we were only 12 people. We didn't have the scale to build it twice.
Airbnb sort of regretted this decision.
They did regret the decision.
Was it the same for you, or was it entirely different? Was it good for you guys?
In my opinion, I mean, there is certainly, like, especially at that point, and probably even now, there's different kinds of engineers. There's I'll put it in Ruby terms, since you're in that term. So there's like, this didn't work how I expected. Like, file an issue or ask somebody. And then there's the type of engineer that does bundle open and figures out what's going on. Like, you definitely had to be then, and maybe even now, the second kind, just in the node modules in this case, to get everything working. And so like there's struggles there, and like it's a challenge. When I read that blog post, probably biased, I see mostly organizational challenges, not technical challenges, around code sharing and a variety of other other things from Airbnb.
It reminded me of when Twitter shared the whole, like, we have to rewrite it from Ruby to something else. I don't remember what it was at the moment. And then they sort of admitted it was more of structural decisions and internal organization rather than just technology, right? Because they were just not implementing it the right way. So for me, it was also a little bit like that, right? At the end of the day, it's not so much about the technology. Is it your team ready to do this, and are you taking the right decisions? But whatever.
I mean, they grew the team to like, I don't know how any code base, I don't know how any mobile code base, frankly, scales to 1,000 users, 1,000 developers. Like, there were all kinds of things. And so like they were hoping to do it for code sharing, but there were other problems by adding all those engineers in. And so like, obviously I didn't scale TaskRabbit to 1,000 developers, so I don't know. But at least half of what I saw in that article wasn't a technological issue, and we didn't experience the same.
And that's one of the things that we always like to advise other companies. Like, if you're taking such a new technology like React Native in 2015, for instance, there's going to be breaking changes in the new versions, right? So you might want to, if you want to really to scale, like maybe you should choose something more consolidated, right? We were having a conversation today with a big corporation about, using React Native today versus Angular. It's like, well, both of them are pretty consolidated now. But 2 years ago, React maybe was not that stable, right? Yeah. And in 2015, Angular went from AngularJS to Angular 2, Angular now, and it was breaking changes. So now both of them are pretty stable. Anyways, wanted to get into the role that you're doing right now at Grouparoo. Let's jump into Grouparoo, because one of the things is that probably shares with the previous company is that, as a founding member, you get to be very close to the product, right? And maybe you were a product CTO because you were also a founder. Had you not been a founder, maybe it would have been different, right? What drove you to create the company and then stand up as a CEO this time, a much more public-facing role?
I think, what Grouparoo does, hey, let's be clear, I'm not that far. Like, I didn't become the CEO of Nike or something. I'm the CEO of a small open source code company. So like, that leap is much smaller than, than the public facing commercial something or another. So, baby steps, but Grouparoo is a open source framework for moving data around, specifically for syncing data from your product or your data warehouse into the tools that you're using, like MailChimp or Marketo or Zendesk or Intercom or Iterable or Braze or these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Something I saw at TaskRabbit that has been confirmed, I don't know, 100 times over now, is this interaction between the product and engineering organization and the marketing organization or the operations team, which is, hey, we need data and these tools over here to be successful. Can you help us? And even when I was the executive in charge of approving like $1 million of budget for marketing to move our retention number or something, even then, I understand it's very important to move that number. Even when they asked me for that data to get into our system, like email system like Marketo, I was like, I don't know. I can't really focus on that. Like, I'm moving retention on my funnel. I've got this infrastructure project, and the reality is no engineer was excited about doing this. You just don't wake up in the morning excited to sync data to Marketo. And it held us back as a business because something like retention is a huge lever to be successful. Someone buys, 2 times a month instead of 1 time a month. You've doubled your revenue. Like, this is amazing. And yet every quarter we're like, oh gosh, we didn't move it. And I think it was a lot to do with this reluctance to integrate well with the tools and really empower that marketing team to be successful. And in the end, that's because it's not fun and it's annoying. And so when an engineer eventually gets that story, like, okay, every time someone signs up, sync them to MailChimp. They're like, first of all, they say, do I have to do this? And they're like, yeah, you got to do this. I'm like, okay, fine. So they Google sync data to MailChimp, and they get like MailChimp's API and a variety of different ways to meet with a salesperson. And they're like, okay, I don't know, maybe in Rails, you would, if you're using delayed job or rescue or something, you'd schedule something to run every day and you do a bunch of queries and you'd put it up in MailChimp. Maybe otherwise you'd run a cron job or something like that to do that, and you make some new thing. Mm-hmm. And you'd be like, oh, thank God. And maybe you'd test it, maybe you wouldn't. If you did test it, you'd use VCR or something like that to record it, and you'd hope never to have to do it again because you don't want to get back in that system. Is this a story you've heard before in general?
Yeah, then because it breaks, they change the API and things like that, right? So
exactly.
It's a story that comes back every now and then. Like, it happened to us. We've got integrations all over, MailChimp, Slack, Typeform, what have you, right?
Exactly. And so now, the first time you're here, it breaks is from the marketing team. And you don't know how it braked, and you didn't really, it's not your best work. Yeah. And then they're like, oh, now we need lifetime value in there. And you're like, oh, fine. Like, and you put it on some spreadsheet and you try to do them all at the end of the quarter, and you have to re-record all that stuff. And in general, it's just not what you want to be doing, which is building the core product. Even better, if when you search for sync data to MailChimp, in the top 5 was an open source solution where you say you install this, you teach it a little bit about your system, and you say go. And now you've got a great architecture to sync your data into not just MailChimp, but you won't have to actually rewrite anything when you then need to sync that same data when you decide to upgrade to Braze. Or the CS team comes and says, we want to get some data into Zendesk. And so now we're syncing all of that data around no problem, and it's just a day instead of a month to do a big integration. And I don't know, happier developers, happier marketing team.
So that's you kind of like answered the question that I was gonna ask you, which is, did you find this pain point in your previous company? It seems yes. So did you who are the co-founders? Like, who did you co-found this with? What are the roles?
It's like a getting the band back together kind of story. I worked with Andy and Evan circa 2013 to 2015 at TaskRabbit. And we experienced this. We built the version of this ish that we had at TaskRabbit. Andy was in charge of the product. Evan was in charge of DevOps and marketing integrations and other odds and ends. And, you know, as I was thinking about the next thing that company that I wanted to build, thought about the problems that I'd had, and this one just kept coming up and it was still unsolved. And we think there's a really big opportunity for open source to solve it.
And why didn't you build it within TaskRabbit? Was it something that just, you know, you had the idea back then, or you had it afterwards? Because it seems like you had it back then, but was it there no space to build this kind of side projects, or you felt like it was time for you to move on?
You mean, why didn't I stay at TaskRabbit and build it?
Why didn't you build it within TaskRabbit?
Yeah. Well, we built a version of every company eventually builds something to sync their data around. It's just what's needed. And so, but it was get this done as quickly as possible. And so it would it would make a bunch of queries and figure out the data it needs to send, and then do this and do that on a schedule and or triggered by our message bus system. Mm-hmm. Nobody internally would spend the time to put the UI and the care and certainly all the integrations that we've done in Grouparoo, because
no, of course not.
You don't have a year to build a syncing system that isn't, your core product. That's why our open source thing adds so much value. And so, in general, after 10 years at TaskRabbit, I thought this should exist, but it still wasn't the right call for TaskRabbit to pay me as the CTO or any of the engineers to put this much effort into a solution in this space, because it's just we had to expand in Italy and Spain and all these other places, and so we didn't incubate it. I didn't build it myself in TaskRabbit because it just wasn't the right investment for TaskRabbit. Now, once it already exists, just like building your own new front-end framework, maybe something should exist, but it's not that investment to make. But now that it exists, it's like you have had an engineer or two working on the best possible way to sync your data around for a year or more. It'd be crazy not to at least try it out. Right. Also, because you mentioned that by the time of the acquisition, you had only 12 engineers, right? So certainly. You didn't have enough bandwidth for that. I mean, had you been Google, you can always have the 20% rule, and you could build this and 10 open source libraries, right? And a programming language and what have you, right? Exactly. But just, you wanted to keep your team focused. However, you decided, what other things did you bring into the company that you've taken from the previous experience? It's seems like you brought some team. You brought an idea that you had already previously tested, which I think it's brilliant, if you will. But what other things have you brought into the company that you have piggybacked from TaskRabbit? I think, per our previous discussion, we did not bring Rails. All of this. That was my next question. Is in Node.
All right, good to know.
It's. Maybe there's something going to be in the new Ruby version, but in general, this job, the actual job the code is doing, is 90% of the time waiting for MailChimp to tell us something, asynchronous HTTP calls. And so even in TaskRabbit, we didn't build our sync engine in Ruby because it's just not the most efficient situation. The scalability is much better in Node and the event loop and such, multi-threaded. Mm-hmm. And so we didn't bring that, but we did bring testing, which is strongly from the Rails community, now making its way out to all of these other things. We're actually super excited to bring this notion of, if not TDD, but just in general testing to the data space. Most people that build these syncing kind of apps basically code something up and then look over in MailChimp to see if it's right, which is really kind of crazy if you've got 1 million users and when they get added or removed or something like that, triggers all kinds of crazy email campaigns and things like that. And so we're super excited to bring testing not only to our product, but to the people that build on top of our library, and how they can be more confident about these kind of integrations.
And you sort of answered my next question, which was going to be, what's your tech stack? You mentioned only Node, but what's the rest of the tech stack? What technologies are you using? Because I'm curious about, it's a company founded in 2020, right? It's super recent. I mean, I can tell by heart most of the tech stacks of companies created between, 2014, 2018, maybe, but like 2020, it's already interesting. I mean,
yeah, I think it's dependent on the problem at hand.
Yeah.
I think that if you're going to build Grouparoo, like, you should choose something that's optimized for multi-threaded something. And so, like, a good answer might have been Go or Node or something like that. Then next question about the business, like open source, not open source, like developer profile that you're talking about. Like, in general, JavaScript has huge penetration. And so basically we took multi-threaded and then popular language and knowledge. Because we hope, like, I've talked to a developer in Vietnam and Brazil, and they're doing integrations to the equivalent in their country of MailChimp. Like, we would never do that. And so how do you make that easy? At least part of that is language accessibility. We chose, that same thing had us lead to choosing TypeScript, actually, not just Node and not just JavaScript. Because when you're hoping for plugins, it's super important to be super explicit about what your API contract is. And so, so that's how we made that choice. If I was building like a SaaS B2B knowledge management system, like, I'd probably choose Rails. If I was building something in the data science AI space, I'd probably choose Python. I think it somewhat depends on the company, I think.
If you got, like, I don't know, what about the rest, like front end database or like
so
stuff?
Grouparoo runs is an app and a syncing engine. It runs on top of Postgres or SQLite, actually. No particular reason it couldn't run on top of MySQL. There's a ORM equivalent in Node, active record equivalent. The background job processing is very close to Rescue. It needs Redis. The front end is in React.
And that's a very, very popular choice for 2020. Actually, one of the things...
and Next.js. Very good
Next.js.
Project. I recommend people check it out.
Okay. Yeah, it's good. I mean, up what we were commenting before, right? React has suffered a lot of changes in the last few years, but it's pretty stable right now, and it's good to see. We've built a lot of projects in React recently, so we also have got this learning curve and like suffer a little bit of all these like breaking changes and the switch between the approach of working with like the object towards hooks and all of that. So in the last year or so it's been kind of crazy, but interesting nonetheless. I mean, we suffered the same when we adopted TypeScript in, I think it was like early 2015, something like that.
Wow, that's early.
That's pretty early. Yeah, that's pretty early. And another thing that you mentioned here, and maybe more like people in the business side of things. I mean, for tech people, it's easy to explain. The people in the business side of things, it will be a little bit harder for them to understand. Why did you build it open source, right? What's the reason? And why shouldn't they scared of using an open source technology? I mean, it's 2021. We shouldn't be having this conversation. Yet, it still happens.
You think that business people are scared of using open source? For what reason?
Because I think that most of them, or like a lot of them, significant number of them, they still don't know that most of the things they're using nowadays, they're open source now, right?
Yeah.
But if we're talking to the corporates, let's rewind 10 to 15 years when I started working. Open source in big corporates and things like that, it was a forbidden word. It was a huge red flag. Like, obviously, you should be using Oracle. You couldn't be using, open source databases. You wouldn't be using Ruby on Rails. You have to use, So
I've never met a marketing person. I mean, it's just about familiarity. Like, I've never met a marketing person that was like, I'm not using WordPress. Like, that's not a thing. I've heard, but like, there's a general,
but not for
executive notion of owning your own IP or something like that. I generally understand that.
And your data as well, because we're talking data, not some marketing pages. And I think like here it's more sensitive because we're talking about data, right?
Right.
So,
well, something very interesting that actually open source and self-hosting enables in this space is actually owning your data. So how would you do this otherwise? You would spray as much data as you can out to these tools, and now it's over there.
Yeah.
And maybe you send your country and your address and your lifetime value and something else over to a tool like Marketo or Iterable or whatever, so that over there you can make a dynamic list called high value Barcelona customers, right?
Yeah, correct.
Using Grouparoo, especially with GDPR and these kinds of things, like there's a risk in that. Using Grouparoo, this is running inside your own cloud, in your own Postgres database that you own, and the group part of Grouparoo is that we do segmentation too. And so you can define the properties that are interesting to you, your lifetime value, your country, your city, all these things. And then you can make segments out of those groups, because we're a kangaroo-themed group building tool. And so now you have this high-value area of Barcelona, I said, customers. You can sync the notion that they're in that to that tool, and actually less of your information left your firewall. Which is great for privacy. So now your marketing team can use that, and the PII never actually left. So among other things, GDPR, those kind of data governance things, a lot of medical companies are very interested in Grouparoo, because it's the same sort of story with their health information. You just can't be sending somebody's prescription to MailChimp.
Yeah,
but if you keep it in your own world, you can create a tag called "should email them about whatever" in MailChimp using Grouparoo.
Yeah. Now, are you facing any sort of resistance of companies trying to use your product just because it was created 1 year ago and precisely being open source, and then a relatively new technology into the market? Or you're still not servicing those kind of clients that perhaps are too big? Like, what stage of the sales are you at right now? What is your target client?
Most of our organic adoption, because you asked why open source. Open source first because engineers are making this discussion. So like, if the marketers, in my experience, go from saying like, yeah, we should use this system and this is how we should do it because I feel comfortable in that system, to, oh my God, engineers, I just want to send a cart abandonment email. Like, please, whatever you pick. And so open source is a way to engage with the engineers and have them feel more comfortable setting it up and have control over their data and all this, a lot of the reasons that they're not excited about using the SaaS tools. And therefore, the people that are adopting organically our solution are where the engineers are Googling or hearing about us and making those decisions. And so it tends to be in medium to smallish companies. Like you've got the first growth engineer that's focused solely on helping that marketing team or to move some number or something like that. And they need to, or they're just adopting, they're moving off of they're moving from like a newsletter to like real personalized marketing and things like that. And so at this point, biased of course, but when Grouparoo exists, it's crazy to write your own custom syncing framework inside of your own tool or anything. You might as well use the what's available. And so those people are adopting it. Some of the bigger companies that are doing it are more or less on the same trajectory. They just are switching tools, or they want to enable new things like the health people I talked about. They want to enable new marketing capabilities and still be seriously controlling their data.
Because how big is the team right now? How many clients have you got, more or less, kind of to put things into perspective? In 1 year, what have you accomplished?
We have like tens of people doing this in production, not hundreds.
And how about like the thing, like I wanted to ask one of the particular cases in which I think this can be useful. You tell me otherwise, because we've got, like, for instance, in our company, we've got a lot of integrations with the marketing tools. And granted, we're not very big, but we're pretty active in the marketing department because we're a purely inbound company, right? So we leverage the use of like Typeform. We've got HubSpot, then we've got, what else? We've got Zapier, we've got MailChimp, we've got social media, we've got a podcast, we've got YouTube here and there. We've got and Slack, then we also have got a community on Slack with an auto-invite thingy built with Typeform. So it's kind of like, it's a mess for a company of only 15 people, right? Sure. So the main, it's not only about the cost of building these integrations, the migration is even more painful. Is a tool like Grouparoo also useful in migrating from one tool to the other, or not yet? Is that something that's in the roadmap, or is it already useful from what you have right now?
Yeah, what we have right now. So it's just like, if we're talking to CTOs here, right? Like it's like good architecture, right? Like almost every integration that you build as quickly as possible to one thing, you like, all right, what do they need? Well, they need their email address and their lifetime value and whether or not they've signed up for this or they've used this piece of the product. And like, I don't know, you're writing some queries and it's very tied to whoever you're integrating with, right?
Right.
A good architect, if you were going to do this on purpose and you knew ahead of time that you would have 3 different things, and by the way, you might migrate this other thing, you would abstract those properties of those customers a little bit, and then calculate all of those, and then map who gets what, right? Sort of a, I don't know, an abstraction layer, or just a sort of data foundation. And so that's what Grouparoo does. You define your data, what it means to be lifetime value means. Like, is the query that gets lifetime value, does that include where is not canceled on your purchases table or is returned? Like, exactly what does it mean for a lifetime value? And then somewhat separately, architecturally and like configuration wise, you say, okay, great, MailChimp gets lifetime value. What this means is that incrementally switching from MailChimp to Braze or adding in Zendesk, because maybe you want to tag your users in Zendesk as VIPs and they get faster, customer support. Incrementally, what that means is like a 10-minute job. You just say, okay, great. Grouparoo's already written the integration to Zendesk. All I need to do is say, these are the data points that I already have to send. And so upgrade scenarios and adding scenarios are trivial once you've done that first integration.
And one thing that might not be trivial is moving from I assume purely B2C company that you had at TaskRabbit to an open source framework that's, I think, oriented to B2B companies, right? So what implications does this have on the technical side? Maybe B2C needs to scale faster and then be more oriented towards marketing, whereas B2B open source, requires more documentation, doing things right, more like, I don't know. This is the first time I asked this question, so.
Sure. Part of the appeal for me was trying a new space. Like, I did not have it in me to do another peer-to-peer consumer marketplace, right? Like I'm good. And like,
Donnie, check, right?
For a couple of reasons. Like, it's just a lot of that. And every human, I think, likes to try new things. And B, like, I would actually be scared to join another company or make another company. Like, I probably don't have many new thoughts in that area, frankly. And so let's try something B2B. And it's different. Like, I'm using HubSpot to track who our customers are, for example, and I'm doing sales calls, and I'm doing podcasts like this. So it's about community building, mostly the open source, but vaguely the B2B notion too, is about community building. This thing isn't going to live or die if by the code working or not. Like I'm very confident that our code is working as well as can be. It's more about telling the story and building the community that's going to be important. Like there's plenty of things on GitHub, 100,000 lines of code that is great. It's the issue is that nobody knows about it. And so more than anything, it's around my job now is around evangelizing.
Yeah, it is. And that's sort of, it makes me go into the next question. Last two questions before we wrap it up. The first one being, you were a product-oriented CTO, right? And now you created this company that's, it's open source. It's very, so to speak, very oriented to developers, because at the end of the day, even though it's, it's for marketing people, it's data-driven. But at the end of the day, developers do these sort of integrations. Definitely. They will understand better your product, and probably, I don't know, maybe it's like the CTO is going to be buying the product, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Or CDO even would be buying the product, right? Yes. But how do you keep the company website and the pitching and like your message from being too technical, right? Because at the end of the day, you need to sell the product. And if you're too geeky, you will not sell it, right? So it will be more complicated. You cannot go mainstream from day one. I don't know if I got the message through, but...
I think it's a real persona-based question, right? Like where we're at right now, building out the community, is every time we've changed our website, actually, we've made it more geeky.
All right. So you're going into the other direction. Less accessible, more geeky.
In the beginning, we pitched the company mission on the website and when we talked to people, and we talked to marketers. And frankly, it was really easy to get them to want to use our thing. Like you can have some if you're a developer talking to a marketer, you can have some very empathetic conversation if you want to about how their life kind of sucks because they don't have the data they need to be successful. It's easy. And they're like, oh, thank you. Finally, like a developer that sees me. Like I've been trying to have that for years. And then you're like, great. So let's use this thing. And they're like, great. And I'm like, okay, now let's get your CTO on board. And they're like, oh, well, that's not going to work. Like this isn't the first email that the CMO has sent to the CTO saying, let's try out this crazy tool. Like that, generally speaking, that's not a fast track to success. The open source angle and what we're trying to do here is acknowledging that the gatekeepers to this system are the engineering organization. And they're gonna bring it in. And so every time we've changed our homepage, it's actually closer to the personas we're focusing on, the growth engineers, the data engineers, the platform engineers. And the pitch isn't like solve your organization. It's like get your marketer off your back. And the marketer is going to be happy when they do implement it, and now they can self-serve their data and all this amazing stuff. But the gatekeepers to the system are the engineers. And so if anything, we've gotten dorkier every time we've updated it.
And I think that's why you will be successful, because if you want to build community with an open source project, actually what you need to do is acknowledge the people out there who are going to support these as engineers 99% of the times, right? So it's good to build a community around them. Let's wrap it up by asking.
There's no marketer super passionate about React, like
no.
It's just a way to accomplish their goals. It's the engineers that are making those choices.
Unless they're writing the RFP for a marketing website and they heard React is good and they want to go React. They don't know why, but they want to go with React, right?
Well, that's good. It's good to be the consultant then.
Correct. Yeah. Let's wrap it up by asking the signature question of this podcast. So what's the biggest tech fuck up you've ever done? And if you can quantify it in money.
Tech F up. All right. Yeah. So Most of the fuck ups that I think about are business related. The biggest tech one that I won't give an exact dollar amount on is when we, circa 2018, TaskRabbit had a security incident and we got hacked, essentially.
Yeah, all right.
This is like the worst possible scenario in the CTO kind of vibe, right? Like personal information. Fortunately, a variety of things were, like good password practices and whatnot, but like screwed up our whole infrastructure. We had to rebuild everything from scratch, basically, as quickly as possible. And then you have to do all of the data breach stuff, which can be quite expensive. We had to pay for credit reports for anyone on our platform, millions of people that wanted it, for example, as part of a data breach response.
But why was that your responsibility? Like, was it some kind of negligence, or why was it yours? Because it seems like a company-wide issue, right? Or
not personally. Like, I didn't personally have to.
Oh no, yeah, I'm asking for like a personal tech fuck up, like something you directly caused.
Yeah, sure. And so, like, it's hard to say when you're CTO who directly caused it. Like, we can go through the
something
post-mortem.
You can know.
But there were mistakes in the company that caused it. My personal, like literally, like some code I wrote that was a disaster or something like that. Okay, here's one. So I don't know how many millions of dollars, but it's just thinking of random case. So we want a performant website. And so, leaning into the Rails situation, we were doing page caching on our Rails pages. And so, the ERB template would, render, and the whole page would render, and we would write that file to disk. And so then Nginx is on this box. And so when it was rendering, before it went to Rails, it would say, like, does this file exist in this folder structure? So our homepage really only had to hit Rails once, which was great. And so the first person that got it, it took, I don't know, let's call it a second or whatever, on the order of a second, but the next person was on the order of 10 milliseconds.
Yeah.
Great. So then, okay, great. Now we're investing in SEO, and that's a part of performance is a big part of that. And so we're building out this whole framework so that the URL, like TaskRabbit /San Francisco /neighborhood /handyman, like combinatorics of all of our places and all of our tasks exist.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And so now all those pages exist, and that's great. We had a model that combined all the geographies and all of the things, and we looked them up and rendered it, and that's fine. And so we want to page cache that too. Great. So that's happening. Then it's like, well, the odds actually of any given human hitting any one of these now 100,000 pages are fairly low. So the first time the Google bot hits it, it's going to see it be slow. And we don't want that. We want it to be fast. And of course, every user should be fast the first time. All right, great. So what we need to do is pre-cache all of these things. And so we've got N servers. I don't know. Let's just say 10 plus, maybe 100. I don't know. Any given time. And we basically need to hit all of these URLs on all of these servers so that we write the file to disk. So, okay. So I add something in Rescue to do this, and basically per server hit all of these URLs. And then there's some error handling and whatnot. Long story short, I deploy this, and we're basically DDoSing ourselves. Like every time this runs, 100,000 requests all in the same second or whatever hit.
All right.
Not just the whole TaskRabbit, but each of our servers. to generate all of these files ahead of time. It was, not so smart, basically.
But we all learn from that. That's why we want to share it. We want to make it more accessible. We all fuck up. We've all wiped out production databases. So it's great that you shared. This is a really good one. So thank you for that. Brian, let's wrap it up. 1 minute just to say, how can we help you and what's coming next for Grouparoo?
Yeah. How can you help? Basically, check out grouparoo.com. Check out our GitHub. Try it out. Give us feedback. We'd love to know how it's going and if it's helping you. And we're using the customers that are, it's free. So the users that are using our thing to drive the integrations we're making. So if you're doing an integration that other people want to do, we'll be happy to help you out there too, and get going and the feedback from the use.
Perfect. I think we can wrap it up here. Thank you very much, Brian.
Yep. Thank you.